Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show. I'd just like to take a moment to tell you about a book that I've written. It's a memoir called Fool Me Twice, and it's a story about my life with a focus on my journey internet dating, where I was scammed and injured in the process. It's an educational book that will help many other people not to get caught in the same trap that I was. I'd like to also take this opportunity to play my book promo for you. Here it is.
From life on a farm in rural Australia, where wide open spaces made a young woman yearn to know what was beyond her country town. She moved to the city, became a mother, and found her dream career which took her across the world. But still, something was missing. In her search for love, she traveled far, trusted deeply. She wanted so badly to find someone that she almost lost herself in the process, and learned some hard lessons along the way. Fool Me Twice, a new memoir by Jules Hannaford. Available August 20th on Amazon.
Today I'm here with Jason Masters. Hi Jason, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Jason, you're here for the Asia Pacific Rainbow Families Forum in Hong Kong. What brings you here?
I think for me, I'm on a bit of a journey. I came out gay about 35 months ago.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. I've got 2 adult children, and I suppose I'm trying to find my place. I talked in my Christmas letter this year that I'd become an accidental activist. I'm just trying to find my place in the community and where I can add value. And so Bess asked me to come up here and I thought I'd see what it's about and see if I can connect with some of the things we're doing back home.
When you say an accidental activist, does that mean that after you came out as gay 35 months ago, you decided that you really wanted to make a difference and help others or increase visibility, or what was your motivation?
The first thing that happened was as I was preparing to come out, we're really lucky in Sydney. There is a government-funded organisation to help women who have a bisexual or gay partner who comes out, to support them. I found that and I was able to provide that detail to my ex-wife. What I found was there's a lot of support services for teenage kids who come out gay, lesbian, bi, transsexual.
Yeah.
But there wasn't anything for children whose father came out. And I saw that was
interesting. Yeah.
Saw that as a bit of a gap. One of the things I do is I'm an educator of company directors, and it just so happened not that long after I came out, within the first year, the president of ACON Health, the AIDS Action Council of New South Wales, was on my course. And I asked him this question, and he did some search and found out there was a gap. And he came and actually checked in on how I was going, which I really appreciated. And through those conversations, he said, look, we think you might be able to add some value with your governance background to ACON Health. Would you consider joining the Audit and Risk and Finance Committee for the subcommittee of the board? And I said, yeah, that'd be great. Then I found through that I was getting involved in supporting some of the AIDS action work. And that just opened up a whole lot of ideas and interests. So from that, I've been getting engaged in some activities. Then we had the marriage equality postal survey. So I was quite involved in that. So that's kind of how I've sort of stumbled into the world of activism in this way.
Wow, that's quite swift, isn't it?
Yes,
considering it's only been a couple of years. That's great.
Some of my sort of new friends have been expressing concern that I'm doing too much too quickly and too broadly.
Okay, but it sounds like you're quite sort of successful in your work and you're well established as a CEO of a company, I believe.
Yes, that's correct.
That probably gives you a whole lot of skills that can transfer into this area. So I think those people shouldn't panic. I think you'll be fine. Do you agree?
One of the things, it was interesting. The first person who I told about my sexual orientation was my doctor. His response was actually phenomenal. He was a Christian doctor, and his immediate reaction was, that makes an awful lot of sense, because I have had a lot of mental health issues over the years. And I had gone back to him to say, look, the psychologist I was seeing ain't going to help me with what I need to deal with, and we need to find somebody else. So certainly with the issues that brought me to needing to come out were mentally health related, and I'm still dealing with some mental health issues as I work through. So I think my friends do have a sense of justification of saying, be careful.
Right, okay, because you don't want to overload yourself when you've got still so much to deal with and you're just finding your feet in the LGBTQ plus community.
And then having the big marriage equality postal survey,
yes, which was huge, wasn't it?
And devastating with the way that was run.
Yeah. Do you feel like your mental health issues were related to the fact that you hadn't come out earlier in your life?
Yes, so I was kind of found with a boy when I was about 14, and that did not go down at all well at home. And the messaging I was getting, particularly from my father, sort of pushed me deeply into the closet when I was 17-ish, I would think. I've got this recollection of going through my 20s, having this tension, but always thinking, no, that's not where I am, and then sort of went on. So the mental health issues are really created by two things. I think one is I'm probably the youngest firstborn of a World War II veteran.
Wow.
And so that meant my father had PTSD, which wasn't recognised at that point of time. I would think doing some writing on this at the moment. I think it was when I was about 16, my dad was in the Repat hospital. My mum and dad went to visit him, and the specialist took my mum and I aside and said, the two of you have to stop pussyfooting around because it's going to kill the two of you.
What did he mean?
He was meaning we were constantly working on edge shields because Dad would just explode.
Right.
We were lucky, very rarely was it physical, but his emotional state was very poor. And then what happened was, I'm an only child, there's a huge amount of intensity. So I suffered a huge amount of emotional abuse. And that was one of the things that I had finally started to deal with in my early 30s. And the real problem I struggled with was I understood the concept of sexual abuse, I understood the concept of physical abuse, but to me, the concept of emotional abuse, me too, just as weak as.
Yes, and that's very typically Australian, isn't it?
Yes.
Especially for an Australian bloke of your era.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And I was lucky I got encouraged to go on a program, and we had towards the end, it was about a 7 or 8 week program, and towards the end there was a weekend away, and based around some Gestalt therapy. And so there was an opportunity for some people to do some work in front of everybody. And it kind of made me feel worse and worse, because I remember being there and watching a man who was raped by his sister and beat up by his uncle. A girl who was, raped by dad and other family members, and a lad who was just beat the crap out of him by his dad. And it was kind of just feeding into, well, I'm just weak as.
Yes, because it's that comparative suffering, isn't it? When you compare yourself to what they're going through, you think, oh, well, how can I be so stressed because mine's not as bad as theirs?
Exactly.
But we shouldn't compare our suffering, but you don't know that, do you, when you're in that situation?
Really lucky. Towards the end, my number came out of the hat. And what really helped me make that incredibly important shift I needed to was, so I did a session in front of everybody, and it was the girl who was raped, the guy who was raped, the guy had crap beat out of him, and they came up to me and said, we couldn't have survived what we saw. I'm just so glad I was beaten.
Yes, because that's the thing. Emotional abuse can, for some people, be more damaging, or it can be internalized so much more. Whereas physical abuse, it's on the outside, but you can see it and it can fade. And that's something that we're only really learning in the last few decades, isn't it? How dangerous and how damaging emotional abuse can be.
That's right.
And it can be a long recovery, can't it?
Exactly. And part of what I've been working on is learning tricks that when I see something or hear something that triggers those things, okay, that's that, then move on from that. Still a lifelong learning. So then overlay that with sexuality and...
Yeah, so you've had a bit of a struggle over many years. So Tell me what it was like coming out at a late age.
Yes.
I mean, obviously with adult children, you're perhaps in your 50s like me.
So I think I was about 52 when I came out.
Okay.
I had been seeing a therapist and it became evident I wasn't able to work with her. She was a Christian therapist. I'd be driving to my sessions with her and thinking, am I going to talk about this stuff? And never would.
Oh.
And I just stopped seeing her. And my mental health deteriorated again. And my wife said, you've got to go back and see her. And I said, well, I stopped seeing her sort of 5 months ago. Go see a GP and find somebody else. And it was in that intervening period, I had myself accepted that I was gay. So that was kind of the helpful point. What then moved on from there was being in that sort of, again, bad mental health state was the first person I told was my doctor. I was very nervous about that. My practice I go to is they're all predominantly Christian and didn't know how we'd react. I thought it'd be okay, but he was just amazing.
Isn't that brilliant?
His immediate reaction was, as I think I said earlier, this makes an awful lot of sense. So that was a good starting point. And then it was his honesty. So I don't live in the gay village of Sydney. Obviously, I live in the suburbs on the northwestern shore.
Yeah.
And so his honesty was then probably the most critical thing. This is not something I've dealt with before. I want to test something with you. If I would assess a person who was needing emergency treatment, I need to get them to see somebody in 24 to 48 hours. If I assess somebody as being in a crisis, I've got about 2 weeks. He said, I think you're in crisis rather than emergency. Does that sound right for you? And I said, I think that's right. If I can find somebody in about 2 weeks, I think it'd be good. So he said, right, the next thing is I don't know who to refer you to. And again, that's honesty from people.
You appreciate that, don't you?
Yeah, we often see doctors as having knowledge about everything. For him to say, look, I don't know who to refer you to. Can we work on this together? Created a partnership between my GP and I, which has just been phenomenal.
That can just strengthen your bond with him, can't it? Yeah, that's awesome.
And there's still some little tensions around the fringes we have because of his faith and my understanding of my faith. But we worked together. It took us about 3 different people to find somebody. And that person was critical in me working through. My ex-wife and I had both been seeing therapists for periods of time for different things. And we kind of have this unspoken rule. We would let each other know when we were seeing a therapist. It was more like, if I come home grumpy, you'll know why, rather than actually saying what we were talking about. So it was a kind of a private space. As I was working through with my new psychologist, it was hard work. It was really hard work.
I can imagine, really putting you in a vulnerable space, yeah?
And so my ex-wife was seeing my mental health in effect deteriorating, where that was probably true, but I actually knew where it was going. So I knew the journey, and in one sense I was feeling better, although I might have been in more difficult space. There were some more intense questions coming. So when I was talking to my therapist about that, he said, look, I need to prepare you for an accidental coming out. So my plan was, my son was doing his year 12, his HSC in Sydney, the last year of school, and I really wanted to wait till his exams were all finished before, upset the family, so to speak. About August, the end of August, I'd come home. My wife was concerned how I was going and started to question me what was going on. Fortunately, the preparation work my therapist had done, so I was using a deflective technique. I don't want to talk about it at the moment. I'm not in the right space to talk about it. And that wasn't being satisfactory. Well, I don't want to talk about it till after my son's done his HSC. That wasn't working. And the problem for me came when she said, all right, so you've got a terminal illness, have you?
So that's what she was surmising because you weren't giving her
any information.
Right, okay. So did you then feel like you needed to tell her the truth?
I told her the truth.
What was her response?
So it was actually much better than I expected. Obviously very upsetting for her. I think a key thing for her was I was able to tell her I didn't have a boyfriend. I'd never been unfaithful in our marriage. That gave her a level of comfort that there wasn't somebody that I was running off with. I think then I had found a place where she could go to if she wanted to get support. And so that meant I was still thinking about her needs. So I think she found that helpful. But she did make this interesting comment. I often wondered whether you were bisexual. So there was something there that she'd picked up on.
It's interesting that some people can just have a sort of innate knowing, can't they, sometimes without anything sort of being said. I remember when my brother rang me to tell me that he was gay when he was about 30, and my reaction was, I know, that's amazing. I was kind of waiting for that day, and I was really honoured that he called me first to come out. So
that's right.
Yeah, and I'm very, very proud to have a gay brother and a gay brother-in-law.
Excellent.
Yes, I've got 2 brothers.
So then it was a journey from there, working out what we wanted to do. We recognised the marriage was ending. We weren't quite sure when that might happen. My ex-wife had a preference for us to stay together until my daughter had finished her HSC, which would be in just over 2 years' time. And that became a tension point. But, that's sort of where we went from there. But we agreed we weren't going to say anything to the kids until after my son had done his HSC.
Have you told the kids now?
Yes, so we told the kids, a few months after that.
And how did they respond?
It was really interesting. So my son had just done the HSC, so he was mentally and emotionally exhausted. And as an 18-year-old male, doesn't say very much.
Yeah, typical. Yeah.
So he kind of just nodded and listened, then left the study, gave my ex-wife a hug, walked off, spun around, came back and gave me a hug.
Oh, that's nice. That probably meant a lot, yeah?
It did.
Yeah.
It did. My daughter, it was different. We sort of talked to her about what had happened, what our plans were, that we were going to try cohabitate until she'd done her HSC. And she started crying, and we couldn't work out quite what was going on. All of this is new, and you're dancing on your feet. You don't know where to go, what's happening. Her response was more about, I want the 2 of you to be happy. And whatever that looks like, that's okay with me. And so she was getting distressed that she thought we were going to be cohabitating because of her.
Which, was that true, really? Sort of?
Sort of, but she didn't want to have that pressure on her.
Yeah, that's so lovely. How mature of her. You must have been incredibly proud.
Yeah, that's right. So then we did cohabitate for about another 6 months. And then with the way the property markets were in Australia, it was best that we then separated the household and moved on from there.
Oh, wow. What a beautiful coming out story. Yes. That's amazing. Obviously, you're Christian.
Yes.
Was that an issue for you to be Christian and to recognise that you were gay? And how did you come to terms with all of that? And what does that look like for you now?
So it's still evolving. I think it's getting more and more concrete. But I suppose I'd been on the side of the more social justice side of the Uniting Church in Australia. So probably had a bit more of a thought about inclusion without necessarily thinking all these things through. It was really interesting when I had my first meeting with my therapist. He said, what church are you involved in? And I said, well, Uniting Church, and he moved on. And I quickly learnt that if I said anything, he would pull me up. And so I was also given permission to pull him up. And later on in that session, I said, why did you ask me that question? And when I gave you the answer, it moved. And he said, well, the United Church in Australia is probably one of the better mainline churches for you to be gay in. There are pockets that are bad, but are pockets that are really good, and most are neutrals. But if you'd been in a couple of the other denominations, I'd be very concerned, and we'd have to do a couple of things. But one of the things that we did work on was, what are the things I need to do? And one of the things I needed to do was to start to talk to my Christian colleagues. When I came out earlier than anticipated, one of the things my ex-wife wanted me to do was to talk to my minister. So I kind of acquiesced a bit and did a bit earlier than I planned.
How did that go?
Went really well. I often talk about there are all these people who are wonderful prayers and have these great connections with God. I've never really experienced that, but I've seen God when I look back in my life. When I moved to Melbourne, the only thing that was familiar to me was a church. And I went to that church, and they were a wonderful group of people and helped me actually reconnect with my faith. When I moved to Sydney, I found a church that was just amazing. They would say my turning up was an answer to their prayer.
Oh, really? That's lovely. Why did they say that?
I was doing youth work.
Oh, brilliant.
And they'd been looking for a new youth worker, and it was something I did on the side. So that was just a wonderful place to be. But also, when I look at it, I could never have dealt with my dad issue with that group of people in Melbourne, but the group of people I was in Sydney actually gave me the support structures to do that.
Oh, that's lovely.
So they recognised I had something I needed to deal with, and there was this beautiful family who I would go see. The first therapist I saw on this journey on a Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. And then after my session, because I was living by myself, they were worried about me being by myself after a session, that I would go wake them up at their house and we'd have breakfast. Wouldn't necessarily talk about stuff, but if I needed to, I was with a group of people, a family, that I could just be safe with after having a therapy session.
Isn't that lovely? And that's one of the beauties of being a member of a church, isn't it? Right. That you have that real emotional support that you maybe can't find if you don't belong to some element of the community.
So then after moving from that church, my then wife and I were at a church very close to home, and one of the themes of this conference has been disruption, and I got very much disrupted. I was very uncomfortable in that church, and something happened and I stormed out in anger. She said to me, we've always wanted to be in the same church. I'm happy here. Can you go talk to your mate and find another church? And so I rang my mate and he said, look, why don't you go to Eastwood and I'll work out other options. So I went to Eastwood and never called him back for the other options. It was a place that I could just sit in the back row and just be there. And over time, I started to realise, there's a lesbian couple with kids here and they seem to be accepted. And, there's another lesbian over there. Didn't see any gay people, but they're involved and they're accepted and they're welcomed. And
did that give you a sense of belonging?
Gave me a sense of belonging. Yeah. And then I didn't really connect with them very much, but I felt this was going to be a safe place to do this personal disruption, so to speak. And so when I spoke to my minister, he was very supportive. We had been just going through a review of our pastoral care program. And I said, this is why I didn't want to have a pastoral care at the moment, because I don't know the people well enough. And he said, who would you like to be a pastoral care? And I said, there's this lady. She was a chaplain, she was a mental health worker, and she was a lesbian. I said, that might be a starting place for me. But I said, I'm worried that this might all be too close to her personally. And he said, look, she's very good at separating out work and church and personal life, so let me go ask. So he went and asked her, and he said she would talk to her partner. And this is kind of the slightly funny part of it is, many people have been very surprised that have never seen me as the gay stereotype. But when she went home that night and spoke to her partner and said, look, our minister has asked about this person. These are the issues that he's going through. Her partner said, that's Jason.
Oh, that's so funny.
So her gaydar was very, very finely tuned.
Brilliant. Was this lesbian minister going to sort of mentor you in a coming out in the church, or just coming to terms with your sexuality?
My general pastoral care, spiritual advisor.
Right, and coming to terms with being gay and Christian.
That's right. Brilliant. And so it was very helpful. I'm on a board in the Uniting Church. So one of the boards I'm on is one of the senior boards. And I was talking to her and I had the same conversation with my psychologist saying, I've got to tell people. They both said, and she remember sitting down having coffee with her and said, why? I said, sense of I've been dishonest. I've hidden who I am. I've been dishonest. And she said, you've never been dishonest to anybody, Jason. Did they ask you when you're interviewed, are you married? No. Did they ask you about whether you're heterosexual? No. So does your sexual orientation have anything to do with the role you're doing? No. You've got no obligation. And so she taught me the concept of, in a sense, protecting myself, working out who I needed to tell, when, why, and why it was important for me.
That's really wise, isn't it? Yeah, really good. But I guess when you actually come to terms with something as big as your sexuality and you make this huge shift, I imagine there's part of you that wants to celebrate that or be accepted by everybody or just be known for who you are and have a pat on the back and everyone embrace you as you really truly are. And I guess that, I imagine, is part of why you felt like you wanted to tell others. Does that make sense?
It does and it doesn't. And I think that's, often say I'm a bit odd and a bit different. So, one of the things I was doing, for several years before I was coming out was watching all these YouTube videos of young people coming out. And, not a lot of YouTube videos of older people coming out. So it's all these...
Have you done a YouTube?
No, I haven't done a YouTube. It's the podcast version, I suppose, the first
exactly,
time.
Yeah.
But what I found interesting is people were talking about how sort of relief there was, the celebration. I didn't have the sense of that. I still had this massive tension of why... I remember talking to my psychologist once, we ended up having this description of my sexuality was in a box and I had a lid on it and I'd got a hammer out and 100 nails and I'd nailed it down. Why did the lid come off? And again, he was very wise. He said, Jason, we can spend time trying to work out why the lid come off, but my experience is most people will never understand why, will work out why. So I think for me, the history I've come through, in a sense, does constrain me from a bit of the celebration.
Right, yeah.
And that I'm still trying to work through what it means to be me. And I think that's the hard thing I'm still working through. Who is the innate natural me rather than who has been in a sense, the actor journeyman for the last 50 years.
Well, that's so interesting. Yeah, that really makes sense. And it does explain that really clearly to me, because as somebody who's straight and never come out, I can only imagine what that journey must be like. But I imagine at a younger age, you don't have so much baggage.
Yes.
You don't have the children and the wife and all of that sort of things. I guess at your age, it becomes a very different kettle of fish.
It does.
Yeah.
But I do love that scene in Love, Simon, the movie. So for those who haven't seen the movie, it's probably one of the first mainstream movies of a teenage gay person coming out. And this is one of his scenes in it where he says, why is it that gay people have to come out and not heterosexuals have to come out? So then they have these scenes of all of his friends who are heterosexual going to their parents and saying, I need to tell you something, I'm heterosexual. And it's quite comical the way they do it.
That's brilliant. There's a great YouTube video of people going around and interviewing people and saying, when did you first know you were heterosexual? And people go, well, I've always been heterosexual.
That's
It's not, I didn't know it. I just am. And it's like, yeah, well, that's what it's like for gay people as well, or bisexual people, or transgender people. It's the way they are born.
That's right. And I think that's the big difference now. I didn't have that language.
Yes, I was going to say that. You know, as a child in the 60s and 70s, you wouldn't have had any role models in the media. No. My brother talks about that as well, that the only one he could sort of get close to was Uncle Arthur in Bewitched, you know. And he loved him, but there wasn't all the queer eye for the straight guy and Orange is the New Black and Laverne Cox and all of these people in the media. Queer as folk. Discovered. Exactly. Did you know what homosexuality was?
No, well, yes and no. I lived in a relatively protected family.
Christian as well?
Not really, but my father wasn't. My mum sort of was.
Okay.
And I was sent off to Sunday school and I was having trouble in school.
Were you bullied at school?
Yes. So the problem I first had was I had a hearing issue and the public primary school couldn't cope with that. It's really simple. In South Australia at that point in time, every kid had to have all his medical tests and I was excluded from those and they kept forgetting. The specialists wanted me to sit in the middle of the classroom because my eardrums would just go floppy suddenly and my concentrations would be one of the early indications of that. But my teachers all put me up the front, so we never got those signals. And I was very tall, so I stood out and, it was just a mess. So I got moved private, what was then a Methodist school, now Uniting Church School, in the beginning of year 5. And that was so changing.
In a good way?
In a good way, but I still got bullied. We never understood why. And I was never called gay or anything like that, but I was bullied and probably we never sorted out why. It was probably one of the reasons why I continued on so long. But the school was as supportive as it could in those periods. But so we didn't have the language of homosexuality, of gay. I was already played around with a boy probably before I was 10.
Yeah.
Going to a boys' school, we were changing all the time. That was a bit of an eye-opener, sort of awareness there. But when I was around 12, I think, there was a murder of a gay lecturer from Adelaide University. His body was dumped in the Torrens River.
Yes, I remember. There was a number of murders. The murders were called the family murders,
And so that made the news a lot. And, Don Dunstan, who was the Premier at the time.
Gay Premier,
introduced the first state to decriminalise homosexuality. But all I was hearing at home was, my dad hated Don Dunstan and my dad hated, this change of laws.
You were getting all these messages that it was wrong.
Yeah. So, 14, I got caught and our family was a great believer in supporting Australian film. And my mum and her girlfriend loved the ballet and so often we would pick up my mum's girlfriend, drop them at the festival centre and then Dad and I would go off and see a film. And, some years after this, Dad just said, we'll go see The Devil's Playground. It's the latest Australian film out. He was horrified. I don't think he realised what the film was about. It's where I learned about masturbation, so that was a great experience.
Can you just give me a quick rundown of what the film's about? I remember the name, but I don't remember the film.
The film's about a Catholic seminary. These were the days where boys left school to 12, 13 and went off to seminary. And seminary was their education, but also the start of their vocation. And the boys going puberty. So one of the early scenes is one boy teaching another boy how to masturbate. Then there's this whole issue of, was this priest gay? Was he struggling with his sexuality and all that sort of stuff?
Did this have any light bulbs going off in your head at this stage?
I did, but then, of course, what I got was the message, well, I hope you don't do anything like that. Because at a boys' school.
Yeah, and this is why you pushed it all aside.
Yeah, this is why I pushed it all aside.
Do you have any regrets looking back over your life? Would you do anything differently?
I think this is one of the tensions. I was often walking, particularly more when I was in Melbourne, walking on the edge of crossing the line and never could. Do I have any regrets?
It's a big question.
It is, and it's something I've had one or two sessions with my therapist.
Yeah, and feel free not to answer.
No. But I think where I've come to is I've got two of the most wonderful kids one could ever ask for.
That's what I thought you were going to say. Yeah. And it means you wouldn't change anything, does it? Because you've got these wonderful children that are probably the light of your life.
Yeah, they're both at university now, doing phenomenal stuff, and both very different. And one's really sporty, one's kind of would like to be the sporty one, but has so many other skills around sport in a different area. And they're both finding their own place in the world. So do I want to change anything? No, I think the challenge for me now is to say, well, in the life I've got left, what do I now want to do with who I am?
Yeah, and that's what you're trying to find now, which is fantastic. What advice would you have for any young person who feels like they might be gay, and especially someone who's a Christian and is struggling with marrying up Christianity and their sexuality? What would you say to them?
Find a safe group of Christians. I'm not saying it has to be gay Christians, but find a safe group of Christians. Because I think that's what my therapist was first testing with me in that very first session. Was I in a church that would be safe?
By safe, do you mean accepting?
Accepting, yeah.
Okay.
What I've realised is there is a group of Christians who want to read the Bible in a particular way. And they forget that people who are writing the sacred text at that point in time are writing it to a particular group of people.
In a particular era. With a lot of metaphors.
Storytelling.
Yeah.
But also in a culture and a context and a history. And if we don't understand that, we struggle to understand the nuances. For me, the Sodom and Gomorrah story is very easy to get rid of because it's actually about raping angels. Argue with that with me as much as you like, because if you want to support raping angels, well then I think we're on different planets. Then there's some nuances in some other Leviticus stories. And what I've discovered is it's actually about patriarchal, because what they're saying is they don't want men to be lesser than women.
Yes, and they want them to maintain control or power, don't they?
So it's all about this patriarchal structure. And so if gay men were to be accepted, well, what does that mean about women? We have to accept women, and we don't want to accept women. And so that whole patriarchal stuff comes in.
Interesting.
And then when you come into the Romans story that Paul writes, people say, well, Paul's very clear about homosexuality. And I say, well, to get to that answer, you've actually got to read those passages back to front. That's a problem first up. But then you've got to understand, who was he writing to? He was writing to the Romans. He was writing into a community where you could be married but go off and have a young boy as your sexual object. That's what he was talking about. He was talking about pedestry, not about loving same-sex relationships. And now what we're discovering, there's this wonderful woman in America. And what's interesting is she comes from a very evangelical background.
Oh, really?
She has no gay children in her family at all. And she has seen the harm that the evangelical churches have done to the LGBTQ people. She's leading a research project at the moment that's going through the archives of Yale University of the translation of the Bible in the mid-1940s that first introduced the word of homosexuality. And it looks like they did not do the academic work, and it was done in a context of a political movement at that point of time. So the actual translation that people are relying on now could actually have been done politically and not academically.
That's really interesting. Did you say in the 1940s?
The word homosexual only came into the Bible in the 1940s.
Wow, I had no idea. Yeah. That's so interesting. I'm an atheist, and so I don't know much about it, so I'm finding this absolutely fascinating. But when I do have students come to me saying they're Christian and that they believe that homosexuality is wrong, one of the things I say to them is that I'm aware that in the Bible it says that men who shave their beards is an abomination, or people that wear mixed fibre clothing is an abomination. I think even eating pork.
That's right, or getting tattoos.
Getting a tattoo, yeah. If you look at that and then they say homosexuality is an abomination, then it just all doesn't make sense. So you can't take it so literally. It is perhaps more of a story. Am I right in saying all that?
You're absolutely right, because If I were to say 9/11 now, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
The Twin Towers.
The Twin Towers coming down.
Yeah.
In 300, 400, 500 years' time, people aren't going to understand. If I've written a cryptic note in my iPad about 9/11, they're going to say, what are they talking about?
Well, they will because of the internet. But back then, it was just
that's
storytelling.
right.
Correct me if I'm wrong again, but when they were written, they were just told as stories, weren't they? They were actually scribed like 500 years later. Is that correct? It's the passing of the story as well that may not actually be literally how it was.
Exactly. It's all about storytelling. It's about what is the purpose. You know, if I'm talking with a literalist, I'll say, well, you know, God created the world in 6 days. I said, but there are 2 creation stories in Genesis. There's umpteen creation stories in the Bible, because it's not about a scientific analysis about how the world was created. And this is why I always say science and Christianity go so beautifully hand in hand, because the science tells us the how and the creation stories tell us the why.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much.
What?
That's really great. That's really a lovely message. And I think anybody who's struggling, whether they're Christian or not, with their sexuality, I think the message is find your tribe, find somebody who can support you. And there's a whole community out there. And really, we are in an era where acceptance, I don't even want to say acceptance, because we shouldn't have to accept gay people. It's about inclusivity, and it's not just LGBTQI+. It's acceptance of everybody, no matter what your culture, your race, your gender, your disability, your age, your interests, everything. Everybody should be accepted. Everybody should be treated with respect. That's the bottom line, isn't it?
And I'm not trying to get too religious, but, you know, if I were to look at the ultimate message that Jesus gave, it was very simple. Love God, love everyone else.
Yeah.
Underpin all of our values and communication with that. You know, it becomes a very simple world.
Jason, that's a beautiful way to end this podcast. Thank you so much for sharing your story with me. It's been absolutely inspirational, and I'm sure our listeners out there will get so much from it. And good luck with your journey finding yourself in the future, and I feel really proud of you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Hong Kong Confidential is brought to you by Teresa's Turkish Towels. Teresa imports the finest 100% Turkish cotton towels that dry very quickly, making them perfect for Hong Kong's humid climate. Say goodbye to the traditional smelly and stinky towels and try the colourful and fresh selections available online or in Teresa's Wan Chai store. Use the promo code CONFIDENTIAL online or mention this podcast when you visit in person to receive $100 off your entire order when you order 2 or more towels. With 100% satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, the only thing you've got to lose are the musty smells that permeate traditional terry towels. Visit www.hkturkish.com in order to get the address and directions to Teresa's semi-hidden location. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.